Hello, this is the next video in a series of lectures I'm putting online that go through philosophy from at least one Christian perspective. Now, of course, I try to present more than just my perspective, both Christian and otherwise. But today, the next three lectures are going to center on the question of what a human being is. What is a person? And we have three lectures that I'm going to give, Lord willing. Now, this is the philosophy of a person. This is the philosophy of psychology. Most of the disciplines that you might study in school trace their root eventually back to philosophy. Now, religion was before philosophy. There's no contest there. Religion came first. But philosophy gave birth to science. For example, the first scientists were natural philosophers. Thales, who thought that water was the most basic substance. There was Anaxagoras and Anaximenes and Democritus, who had the idea of an atom. So science was birthed from philosophy. And there's philosophy of history. There is philosophy of religion, of course. There's philosophy of art. And psychology was birthed from philosophy as well. When we go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s and we look at a person like Sigmund Freud was as much a philosopher as he was a psychologist. And so before there was psychology, there was philosophy. And so we want to talk in these next three lectures about what a person is. This particular lecture, I want to focus on human beings as bodies and human beings that possibly as souls. And so that's the subject for today. What are some of the different views that have been had of a human being as a person? I'm sure I could expand the list, but here are the four kind of views that I'm going to be presenting in these next three lectures. So first of all, I think it's obvious that we are at least biological machines. I fed this machine a little bit earlier, probably fed this machine too much. Occasionally, I exercise this machine. Sometimes I let this machine sleep. Sometimes this machine gets out of whack and it has to lay in bed for a little bit. We are, I think, I don't know who would deny this. There might be someone crazy who would deny it, but pretty much we are at the very least biological machines. The problem is not there. The question is whether that's all we are. Are we just roadkill? As a Christian, I don't believe so. In fact, I don't think that there is any view of a person as just roadkill that is really Christian. That is what we might call a naturalist perspective. The naturalist paradigm basically sees nature as all there is. And so we're just an animal when it comes to that particular perspective. Now, I do believe we're animals, but I don't think that's all that we are. We are far more than animals as human beings. That's my perspective as a theist. You could probably even hold that position as a deist. Am I an animal? Well, I think I'm an animal. I have four legs like other quadrupeds. I have a brain like other primates. In fact, all human life on Earth shares certain DNA. I share certain parts of my DNA with bacteria. I have parts of my DNA that I share with chimpanzees. I have parts of my DNA that I share with fish, and so forth. As you go, this is of course one of the arguments for evolution. Now, I'm not going to argue for evolution, and this video isn't about evolution. But I do want to say that I am an animal. And I don't mean that in let's go party. I mean, I have the characteristics and biology of an animal. My cells have mitochondria in them, just like dogs' cells have mitochondria. I have a nucleus, in my body cells. So I am an animal. That's not all I am in my belief system, but that is part of who I am. So now, these are the two that I'm going to concentrate on in this video. I think most Christians would say that we are not just a body, a biological machine animal, but we have a soul. And now that's called a dualist position, not a Changard, not that kind of a dualist with an E, but a dualist with an A, as in dynamic duo, dual, duality, two. And so I think a lot of Christians have a dualist perspective, which would basically see me as part body and part soul. Throughout a lot of history, I think Christians have viewed the soul as kind of the cut at the dotted line and, hand in that part to God when you die. The soul is the little escape pod in my pituitary. I'm dying. Oh, there goes, get in the escape pod. That's kind of a view of the soul. There are probably other ways of viewing the soul that some Christians have had that I'll talk about in a second, that see the soul as more metaphorical for the part of me that continues forever, however that might be. I'll talk about that, I think, on the next, in a couple slides or two. The second video is going to be on existentialism. Most existentialist perspectives, I think, have been contrary to Christianity. So if you look at the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, or in a proto form, Friedrich Nietzsche, most of that has been atheistic existentialism, although I think there's things that we can probably gather from them. Kierkegaard was a Christian father of existentialism, perhaps. We'll talk about that perspective on a person in the next video. And of course, all of this is leading to the third video, where we talk about a human being as someone created in the image of God. That, I think, is the best way of framing what a person is from a Christian perspective, which doesn't contradict what we're doing today, but gives a more, I think, a rounder sense of it. Okay, so part A, body, and then we'll talk about soul in the second part. Now, are we just roadkill? We aren't. We aren't just roadkill. The Bible as a whole is very clear that we are more than roadkill, although there are days when we feel like roadkill. I mean, there are days. Mother said there'd be days like Ecclesiastes. Here's Ecclesiastes 3. The fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. I should read this in an ER voice. Eeyore. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath. They all have the same breath, ruach, spirit. Humans have no advantage over the animals. All is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust thou shalt return. This is a rather depressing view, isn't it, of humanity? And there are days when it feels like this. Ecclesiastes reminds us of what the world would be like if there were no hope, if there were no eternity, if there were no Christ. But of course, as we Christians don't believe this is the end of the story. It may feel like this sometimes, but there is more. We are not like those without hope, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. But we are in part body. We are in part roadkill. Evil people have done really bad things to the human body over time, and it hurt. Here's more Ecclesiastes. He who is joined with all the living has hope, for a living dog is better than a dead lion. The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. What do we do with these verses? They're in Scripture. Well, I take these verses to tell us what the world would be like if there were no afterlife, if there were no God. I do have a colleague who I haven't read her dissertation. I think she tries to find a way to make these verses not sound like they sound. But I believe in a whole Bible approach, and clearly the New Testament gives us the rest of the story when it comes to the afterlife. And it's very clear from the New Testament that this is not the final answer with regard to death, that there is more. There is life after death. There is even consciousness in between death and resurrection. But we are at the very least biological machines. Here's a pair, you may know this from Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, Abraham Maslow was not a Christian. He was an atheist, I believe. And so certainly this is not the end of the story. And of course, even as a psychologist, this is not necessarily without critique. But it does remind us of our humanity, I think, because we do have physiological and body needs. Believe me, we do. I ate, a couple hours ago, and I probably could have gone without eating. I probably would have been better if I didn't. But, eating is something my body wants to do. Drinking is something my body wants to do. I have some water here. I had coffee. I didn't need that. Occasionally I need to use the restroom. Oops, sorry. embarrassed I said that. Not really. But anyway, you see that we have bodies, and our bodies have drives. Our bodies have desires. We have safety and security needs. When we are afraid, sometimes we do silly things because we're afraid or because we want security. We have social and belonging needs. We want to be loved. We want to find somebody to love. Somebody should write a song like that. Okay, we have self-esteem and respect needs. Self-actualization was something Maslow came up with, where we completely are self-sufficient, and we are self-motivated, well, anyway, we can leave the top of the pyramid off. And of course, religious needs fit into all of these, or many of these at least. Safety and security, religion. Social belonging, religion. Self-esteem and respect, religion. Of course, religion can be used in a good sense. My point is that our bodies have needs. We are humans. We have chemicals swirling around in our bodies. We can become addicted to things. So people do things when they're addicted that they wouldn't do normally. People who are addicted to heroin, for example, will steal, even murder, in order to fix their addiction. They'll do bad things to their children. I'm a Wesleyan in the Methodist tradition, and I believe in Christian perfection in the manner of John Wesley. Won't go into it, but there's a question: can a person who's addicted live above temptation? Well, I think the promise in Scripture to live above temptation probably assumes that a person is in some kind of a normal zone. Maybe this is bad theology, but a person who's on cocaine probably is going to need to be delivered before they're going to get to the point that they can live above temptation. They're a slave to chemicals. Of course, we get angry. Some of my kids, I won't say who, we used to say that they were getting hangry. They would get very kind of testy because their blood sugar had gone down, and it was clear that they would not behave this way if they had food. So it's time to get some food. My pastor, Steve Deneff, was talking a few weeks ago about how he says silly things when his blood sugar goes low, and sometimes his mathematical skills go out the window. So sometimes his wife will give him a math problem just to test and see where his sugar level is. I know people who I was having a friendly conversation not too long ago about someone who seemed to be behaving strangely, and again, we had a human answer having to do with body chemistry to explain it. And so that's part of who we are, right? We aren't just brains in a box or a brain in a vat. We have body chemicals, and our chemicals affect the way we behave. We have personalities. We have particular temptations. There are things that don't tempt me that would very much tempt somebody else. There are things that are easy for me that are not easy for someone else. And so my personal philosophy is that if something's easy for you, we shouldn't necessarily call it a virtue. That it's the things that actually are difficult for us that we find the path to self-discipline to do. That's an area of virtue. If it's easy for me to go give to the poor, then how virtuous is that? If it's hard for me to give to the poor and I give to the poor, then that's an indication of greater virtue, I think. And so, some people are thinkers and some people are feelers. There's some people who listening, you might say, man, you are so great at listening to that person. But maybe it's easy for them to listen to other people. But a person who finds it hard to listen to other people, there's a humanness to us. We are humans. We have brains. This is the amygdala, where primal fear and flight are located, emotion in the thalamus and hypothalamus, the limbic system here. Our thinking is a matter of our cerebral cortex out here. But let me tell you right now, the primal part of our brain is a lot more powerful. I I love people who listen to long lectures. I mean, how did they do that in the old speeches in the 1800s? You know, the long-winded with all kinds of classical references to Homer and stuff. I mean, lock her up, lock her up. I mean, that's a lot more effective. That hits the limbic system and our emotions and things, and it has very little to do with our reasoning. We are human beings, and we are animals, and we are susceptible to these things. We can be trained. We can be manipulated. B.F. Skinner, of course, not a Christian. Does that mean we can't learn something from him? We can learn something from him. Skinner talked about behavior modification, where you use positive and negative reinforcement. I remember there was a sitcom episode where a very smart person wanted to manipulate a person that talked a lot into not talking a lot. And so every time she didn't talk a lot, he gave her a chocolate. And I mean, it's a comedy, but you get the point. He was training her not to talk by giving her a chocolate every time that she did what he wanted her to do. And of course, this is true. Of course, whatever your politics, the overwhelming majority of the intelligence community, this is 2018 as I'm making this video, the intelligence community and even Russia has pretty much admitted that they tampered with and Google and Facebook and Twitter have all agreed that they were targeted. And so this is really not a matter of debate. But America's behavior was modified by ads and videos that were channeled in certain direction. We were manipulated in various ways, and it was to create dissension. So it wasn't just the one side that was manipulated necessarily, even though it's pretty well agreed that a certain side was the favored side. But I mean, there was dissension sown, I think, on both sides, not just on one side. The division was, we were manipulated to become divided even more than we were already. So this is an example of how we can be trained and manipulated just like other animals can be. Did I miss one here? I don't think I've missed it yet. Okay, so we can have neuroses and psychoses. So we like to make fun of Freud. You know, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but a lot of what he says we agree with. You know, even though we joke about, tell me about your mother. You know, here, lie on the couch. We joke about those things, but I think we've all come to agree that our childhood has a significant effect on who we grow up to be. Often, that we often find ourselves trying to undo our childhood without, you know, being able to control ourselves half the time. But some of the things that Freud talked about actually ring very much true to common experience. So the idea of projection, that when you feel guilty about something, you have a tendency to see other people as guilty of the same things. Heard a story once of a wife whose husband was having an affair on her, but he was convinced that she was having an affair. And this is perfectly natural because he felt guilty. He projected his guilt on her. So projection, this is the Matthew 7 syndrome. Judge not that you be not judged. First take the log out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of somebody else's eye. We are human beings. We rationalize things. Rationalization is where, you know, well, she's worse. You know, when you're found guilty of something, you basically explain it away. Well, I was tired. You know, I'm sorry, I'm tired, or I haven't had any food. You know, they always say that if you really want to look, if you really want to be respected, when you're don't make excuses when you're caught having failed. That's rationalization. Sublimation is perverted. Sublimation is where you redirect your anger, or you redirect your, you know, so when you're angry, you go chop some wood rather than punch somebody. You know, go for a run, take a cold shower, rather than express your emotions in a bad way, or bottle them up. Repression is when you bottle up your frustrations and you don't let it out, and that's a cork that'll pop off at some point. Of course, there are a number of kind of psychological, I mean, we call them disorders that a person can have. A person can be obsessive compulsive. You know, I have to have my steak and shake burger on Tuesdays a certain way. Now we've learned to manage a lot of these. I know I have. I think I've had some. I don't know that I'm outside the whatever normal is. But I mean, who says what's normal? I feel like I'm kind of within the range. But I won't tell you all my personality quirks. But we all learn to cope with these things. Sometimes we take medication for these things. I know that there's some children that if they don't have their ADHD medication, then nothing's going to happen in that classroom, because that child is going to completely disrupt the day. And that child needs to be taken out of the classroom because they are not capable of controlling themselves. Of course, when you combine, sometimes in America you combine a parent who is addicted to drugs with a child who maybe is suffering some of the consequences of that. It's not unknown for a parent to sell the ADHD medication, to feed their addiction. Meanwhile, the child then is set up for complete failure in school. This is where we're at in many places. I don't need to go through all these. My point is that our body chemistry and our psychology, there are things that we have difficulty controlling as human beings. Accountability. I mean, in the Christian community, we talk about having accountability partners to help keep us from giving in to our basal urges. We're biological animals. Lastly, we're herd animals. I am totally convinced that human beings we're a group culture. Now, the Western world is unusual in that it has gone highly individualistic in some respects. We can have it our way at Burger King. Hold the pickle, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us. Have it your way at Burger King. So we date so we can find out whether we're compatible. We're very unusual in the history of the world in these kinds of individualistic things. And occasionally our group-oriented identity comes back into play. In politics right now, again, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, there's a good chance that you're going to support your team no matter what your champion does. So, for example, that would have been true under Obama. That would have been true under Clinton before. And it certainly seems to be true under Trump today. There's about 40% of the American population that no matter what the president does, they're going to support him. He famously said during the campaign that he could shoot someone on, was it 50th Avenue, and all of his supporters would still support him. It's not a matter of intelligence. In fact, I'm convinced that a lot of times intelligence just makes it all the easier to find a clever way to support your team, whatever your team. I'm Team Edward. You can find a way to support your team with your intelligence. That true intelligence, or not true intelligence, but true objectivity is being willing to hear the opposite team's point of view and to think the opposite team's thoughts after them, and to be empathetic towards others, and to get into the heads of others and into the feelings of others. That's true objectivity. That's the real people who are interested in truth do that. That's not most of us. Most of us are herd animals. We're going to defend our family. We're going to defend our nation. We're going to defend our party. We're going to do that regardless of the evidence. I remember, recently in this past year, there was a certain person of a certain group, I won't tell you which, and under any normal circumstances, this person would have completely crucified a particular person. But because that person was in their group, they said, this is a horrible thing that they've said, but you have to understand, again, making rationalizations for this person because this person was related to their group. We are herd animals, I believe. Jonathan Haidt has written a book called The Righteous Mind, and he compares the way we are to a rider on a reason is like a rider on an elephant. The elephant's going to go where it wants to go. The rider might be able to shift it just a little bit, but pretty much the rider is not going to change where the elephant wants to go. And that our reason our writer pretty much most of the time tries to find ways to justify what our elephant already wants to do. Our elephant is our kind of intuitions, our desired outcome. This is who we are as biological arguments, our biological machines. We are not these thinking things. We are much more feeling things, or intuitive things. We're gut things. We are animals. I believe it. I think the evidence is overwhelming. But as a Christian, I don't think that that's the only part of us. I believe that there is a spiritual dimension to the human being that is part of what, when we say that we are, from a Christian standpoint, we are not merely animals. We are, from one perspective, we are not just a body, but we are a body and a soul and a spirit. Now, let me give you some of the views on the soul, because I think, again, part of the purpose of philosophy is to help you to see that there have actually been a spectrum of positions on these things, that it's not just, well, obviously a soul is this. Chances are your view of the soul, if you've never thought about these things, chances are your view of the soul is basically derived from Descartes, who lived in the 1500s, 1600. We would say it's a Cartesian view of the soul, probably, that you have. You know, you may think it's a biblical view or a Christian view, but there's a fair chance that if you've never thought about this, you don't realize that there's more options, or that there have been more perspectives than just that one. So, for example, the soul in the Old Testament, the word soul in the Old Testament, as I'll show you in a second, nephesh, is basically a living being, not a part of a being. In fact, the sea creatures in Genesis 1 are called nephesh kaya, living souls. And so soul did not even refer to a human being in Hebrew in the Old Testament. Soul refers to a living being as a whole, not a part of a being that detaches in an escape pod. The view that people most often have of the soul mostly has its origins in Pythagoras and Plato in Greece before the New Testament. So this is several hundred years before the New Testament. And so that idea of the immortal soul, Plato thought of the soul, Plato thought of our bodies as the prison house of the soul, you know, so that when we died, our soul went to the heavens. Now, I don't know that Plato thought that all of our souls go to the heavens, but maybe the most virtuous of us, our souls would escape the body. So that's that view. A lot of people think, well, isn't that the Christian view? Well, there certainly have been a lot of Christians who've had that view, but that is Plato's view. It's not, in my opinion, it's not incompatible with the biblical view. It's not incompatible with the New Testament view, but it is more of a secular Greek view than it is the New Testament view, as we'll say in a minute. Now, the view, I mentioned a second ago that most of us, the view of the soul that we grew up with is kind of Plato with a Descartes twist. So the scientific revolution begins in the late 1500s and in the 1600s. And what the scientific revolution in the Western world does is it divides the natural world from the supernatural world. That's not a biblical distinction, by the way. In the ancient world and in the medieval world, there is a kind of continuum of being, where there's a scale of being that goes from us to the gods or to God. And so there's not this dividing point where suddenly it stops being material and now it's some kind of non-material or immaterial. The ancients viewed the soul as Democritus believed in a soul that was made up of soul atoms that dissolved at death. The soul was simply the life principle, as I have here under my first one for Democritus. The soul is the life force. It's not some detachable thing that survives death. It's not individual for Democritus. And so what Descartes did is Descartes took the Platonic dualism of body and soul and added this, that the soul is immaterial and the body is material. And that's the way most of us grew up thinking of the soul. Now, there is, of course, those who don't believe in a soul. There are atheists who don't believe in a soul. They're pure physicalists, we might say, just the body. There are, however, non-reductive physicalists. These are people who believe that there is no kind of separate soul, but human life cannot be reduced to a body, that there's something bigger going on here. And there have been a number of people in the last 20 years. N.T. Wright wrote a book called Surprised by Hope, where he tried to argue that the biblical view is not the immortality of the soul. Of course, Oscar Cullmann argued this a long time ago in the 1950s, I think it was, the immortality of the soul versus the resurrection of the body. And N.T. Wright is kind of taking up the torch to say that in the New Testament, it's really a bodily resurrection that is what it is taught, rather than some kind of detachable soul. Joel Green has also done this. He had a co-author. It's a red book, I think, on the immortality of the soul. I don't remember the precise name of it, but these voices in the last about 10 years ago was when this was the talking point. Certainly they're pointing out what is true, that the New Testament is about bodily resurrection far, far more than it's about some immortal soul. Now, I do think they probably overemphasize that a little bit, as we'll see in a second. But I think they're correct in trying to redress the balance. The New Testament does not primarily teach the immortality of the soul, although it may be a little bit there. It primarily teaches the resurrection of the body at a future date, when Christ will return to earth, and there will be a resurrection. Okay, the soul in the Bible. I'm sorry I didn't get for it to come out. But you see the whole slide at once. In the Old Testament, nephesh refers, as I says, to a whole living being. It doesn't refer to, so there is no such thing as a detachable nephesh in the Old Testament. That's simply not what the word nephesh means in Hebrew. Now, in the Old Testament, there is the spirit, the ruach, that comes from God and leaves the body at death. However, most of the Old Testament does not engage the life after death. Or if it does, like Ecclesiastes, it almost sounds like there is no real personal afterlife of any significance. Now, Saul does go to the witch of Endor, and Samuel comes back. We assume it's really Samuel that comes back. And so you do have that in the Old Testament. But you don't have very much at all about the afterlife in the Old Testament. The clearest point is Daniel 12:2-3, which talks about, again, a bodily resurrection. There are a few other candidates, Ezekiel 37, Isaiah 26, where, the question is that metaphorical of a resurrection of corporate Israel rather than individual resurrection? And it's only because hindsight is 20/20 that we read those passages in terms of individual resurrection. Again, we don't have to worry about these things because the New Testament settles all these debates. The New Testament clarifies with great clarity about it. Now, the New Testament does continue this more holistic sense of the soul. So in 1 Peter 3, 8 souls in all entered the ark. It's usually translated 8 persons entered the ark, and so forth. So a lot of the New Testament, and of course Joel Green in his study points this out, a lot of the New Testament continues this sense of soul as a living being. However, it does seem that there are a few places. Now, again, I think this is the minority, just to put things in perspective, but there are a few places, I'll show you one in a second, where the soul is used of a part of a person. But more often in the New Testament, the spirit seems to be the keeper of the person in the beyond life. So that's interesting. You can see, I am convinced that Green and Wright are mostly right, at least, that the immortality of the soul is not at all the emphasis of the New Testament. Well, okay, let's go through this a little bit. So in Genesis 2:7, we get the Hebrew view of a person. And it's basically that God formed man from the dust of the ground, that's the body, and breathed into his nostril the breath of life, that's the ruach, the spirit, and the man became a living soul, that's the whole person. So the living soul of Adam is the whole living person, not another part of the person or an escape pod. This plays into a verse I had earlier from Ecclesiastes. Who knows whether the breath goes back to God? See how that's kind of like the bookend to this. God breathes into a person when they become alive, and then the breath leaves a person when they die. So that breath, and Abraham breathed his last. See that the breath is what. So you might say that from a Hebrew perspective, life begins when the breath begins, and life ends when the breath leaves at the end. Okay. Here's the verse. I didn't have it earlier. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit breath of animals goes downward to earth? Okay. Again, Mom said there'd be days like this. Okay. Now, New Testament. The New Testament, the Old Testament is less precise in my theology. The New Testament is more precise. The New Testament gives us the rest of the story. The New Testament clarifies anything that's ambiguous in the Old Testament. And so here it is. Don't fear the one who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Fear the one who can throw both body and soul into Gehenna. Again, these seem to be two different parts of a person. And of course, you may know that verse in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, is it? May the very God of peace sanctify you, and may your body, soul, and spirit be preserved blameless. By the way, that tripartite thing, that's not common in the New Testament. In fact, I can only think of really two places where there's something like that. The one is that place in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, and then there's Hebrews 4:13, is it, where it talks about God being able to separate between soul and spirit. And so that is not the dominant picture of the human person in the Bible, which suggests to me that it's a picture. Please don't write a doctoral dissertation based upon a tripartite view of a person, because that's just one picture of a person in Bible, from my understanding. Okay, we're almost done here. I do believe that the Bible, that the New Testament teaches that there is an intermediate state between death and resurrection. I haven't emphasized it as much as I should in this video, but this is all headed to, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection. This is the view. The future view is that the dead in Christ will rise, then we who are alive and remain will be snatched up to meet him in the air. There will be a transform. This mortal shall put on immortality. Death shall be swallowed up in victory. We shall be changed. So we're going to be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. There will be a resurrection body. It will be a body. It's not just a disembodied spirit. There will be a time in the future, in history, when Christ will return and we will be transformed into body 2.0. And it will be like Christ's body. We shall bear the image of the heavenly man, which is the resurrected Jesus. We will have the same kind of body that Jesus has. We are brothers and sisters. So I should emphasize that this is where it's all headed. That's eternity. Eternity is an embodied eternity in a glorified body, a spiritual body, as 1 Corinthians 15 says. That's where it is all headed for eternity. However, we do have these instances in Scripture that seem to indicate that we will exist in between our death and resurrection, and that we will be conscious. So, the rich man and Lazarus, this is a parable, by the way. It has the same introductory formula of the other parables in Luke. But it is basically, in the parable, the rich man and Lazarus die, and the rich man's brothers are still alive. The rich man wants to go back and warn them. So the timeline in both Abraham's bosom, hell, or whatever, it doesn't really say what it is, he wakes up in torment, and earth, they're all on the same timeline in this parable. Now, I have had some clever students who've suggested that, well, maybe we sleep until the resurrection, and then at the resurrection, we're in heaven where there is no time. And so even though we haven't been resurrected yet, so my father passed away a few years ago. According to this argument, in the temporal plane, my father is still sleeping. But my father is already in heaven looking down on us now. In fact, he's looking down on Noah as well. He's looking down on Moses, and he's looking down on the resurrection and all that. So that's very clever. And far be it from me, it's above my pay grade to say that isn't true. But I don't think that the biblical authors were thinking that. I think that's kind of goes beyond what the biblical authors were thinking. But the Seventh-day Adventists do believe in soul sleep. There are churches that believe in soul sleep that would say, well, look, 1 Corinthians 15 talks about sleeping, and 1 Thessalonians 4 talks about sleeping. And so we sleep in between now and the resurrection. Well, I take that as a metaphor. And of course, Paul stops using that imagery after 1 Corinthians 15. Paul does use that in 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians 15, but after that he doesn't. In the rest of his writings, he doesn't use that imagery ever again. And so, for example, in Philippians 1, to live is Christ, to die is gain. To die and be with Christ is far better. So, and I don't think he means to die and to sleep next to Christ. What great? That's not great. Or 2 Corinthians 5, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. I don't think that means to be present sleeping next to the Lord. Nor do I think that Jesus is still sleeping. Of course, you could argue that's a different situation. But my point is that Paul seems to indicate that we are conscious in the afterlife, even before this bodily resurrection happens when Christ returns. Of course, the rich man, again, as I said, he, as far as he's concerned, his brothers are in real time with him, and that he could go back before they die and warn them. And of course, Jesus says to the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. I don't think he's saying today you'll sleep next to me in paradise. I think he's saying that you'll be conscious in paradise. I didn't put on here, by the way, Revelation, where the souls under the altar are crying out, how long, O Lord, how long, O Lord? So it does seem to be that we are conscious in between our death and resurrection. What is that conscious state? Is it a disembodied soul state? I think that, the Bible doesn't really explain, but this is where I would say the immortality of the soul does actually cohere with what the Bible says about resurrection. It's just, it's really not as clear as we probably have grown up to think it is. So it's possible. It fits with the biblical story. It's just not 100% clear as to exactly what their state is. And of course, I assume that when we're talking about these things, that God has revealed himself in metaphors so that we can goo goo gaga it. I bet it's beyond quantum physics in how that all works. In my novel writing, it's in the fourth dimension. But anyway, enough of that. I wanted to end this video with some advantages of the soul. Of course, just because an idea is convenient doesn't mean it's right. That's something that we should have gotten from the logical fallacies video. Just because I want something to be true, or just because it's convenient. I mean, it'd be convenient. And I mentioned that my father's been gone for several days. It would be convenient for me to say, well, my father's really not dead. He's been on a long trip. That would be awfully convenient. It's probably not true. And so just because there are certain advantages to the idea of the soul doesn't mean it's true. But I do want to end this video with what I see as some of the clear advantages of belief in a soul. Again, people like Joel Green, N.T. Wright, I'm not sure that I think they believe that resurrection takes care of it. That the idea that God will revive us in the future, he will reconstitute us in some way in the future. I even knew a psychology professor who believed that God maybe gives us a temporary spiritual body in between death and resurrection. He was wrestling with, I don't know what he believes today, but he was wrestling with this question of whether or not there can be existence without a body. So there are other ways to believe in eternal life without a soul. That's my first point. That although the idea of an immortal soul fits very well with eternality, it's not necessary. The idea of a soul is not necessary to suppose that we will live forever, or even that we will be conscious in the intermediate state. However, the existence of an immortal soul certainly does well with the idea of eternality. Here's one that actually I think is really nice. So once upon a time, I was thinking about the concept of resurrected person. So here was the question I had. What is the difference between resurrected Ken and, say, a clone of Ken? So let's say that you could take my DNA and you could grow a clone of me, and you could accelerate, it's like Lex Luthor in Smallville. You could accelerate my growth to where you had a body that was exactly like mine. And then let's say that you could do a kind of scan of my brain and my memory and load that memory. So you had another Ken with my exact genetics, with my exact memories. Now that other Ken would think that they were me. And there would be, I don't know how we would know, how that other Ken would know that he wasn't the original Ken. How would he know? But my question was, if all we are resurrected in something like that, that God takes whatever's left of me, let's say I've been dead for 2,000 years, there's probably not much left of me. In fact, most of what's left of me is probably in other people. God's very good at what he does. But I mean, the reconstructed Archimedes, is how different is that Archimedes if there is no soul? How different is that Archimedes from a clone of Archimedes with scanned memory? And so the soul, this is a very convenient thing about the idea of a soul, that the idea of there being a soul provides a means for continuity of identity between me now and me in eternity. Because you could say, well, clone Ken doesn't have my soul. Original Ken has my soul. And I don't know what will happen to clone Ken when he dies. I mean, these are things we may be debating in 50 years. Is clone Ken a real person? And Bud Bentz once speculated, yeah, we'll end up saying that the same moral responsibilities apply to clone Ken as apply to Ken. That's neither here nor there. Well, it's probably relevant to this subject, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. So the existence of a soul provides a continuity of identity that I think is very nice. Also, the soul provides a possible mechanism for free will, because biologically it's difficult. It's difficult to suggest that I am free, given just my biology, just my humanness. How can I be free? I think we could do it. I think we'd come up with a theory of God energizing just the right parts of my brain, to give me free will. But the soul provides a nice access point for divine grace and for the empowerment to make free decisions for God or to the contrary. I actually, now that I think of it, I believe I have a fourth video in this series on free will. The fourth video will be, it's in the same category of the philosophy of personhood, will be on free will. And free will, as I defined it, is the ability to make a decision that is not determined by cause and effect. That when you take all the causes on my both inner and outer, including my brain chemistry and all that stuff, that when you take all the causes, all of the forces on me, that I can make a decision that is not the sum of all those forces. That's a very strong view of free will. And in that sense, when humans exercise free will, they're creating ex nihilo in the same way God created the universe ex nihilo. The existence of a soul, I think, provides a nice entry point for that to be possible. Well, more on that in our fourth video. Now, of course, apparently, the soul is not necessary to explain my memory, because my brain can explain that, or my personality, because my brain can explain that. You may have heard the story of Phineas Gage in the 1800s, who blew a rod through his brain. Apparently, he was a pretty nice guy before that, but afterwards he wasn't. The rod had changed the physical structure of his frontal cortex and changed his personality. Intelligence, brain can explain that. Emotions, the thalamus, hypothalamus can explain that. And basic will, my brain chemistry. In fact, we are left with this question of what exactly is in my soul. Because take someone who has Alzheimer's disease, the tangling of their neurons and of their ganglia is apparently the cause of their loss of memory, loss of personality, loss of intelligence. Now, I've had students who have argued that the soul is in there, it just can't get out, that its interface in the brain is messed up. Maybe, but it would seem that the brain does pretty much everything that we associate with what a person is. So I'll leave it there, simply to say that the existence of the soul is a nice and very attractive concept. And we can find some verses in the Bible to argue for that. However, we also have God meeting the New Testament authors where they are, and this is a Greek concept, so it would make sense that God might use some Greek images in their world to convey his truths to them. And this is it's not by any means the only view of a person in Scripture, and so I'll let you decide, because you will anyway, right? No matter what I say, you're the one who's going to decide what you believe on this thing. Well, it's been a long video, but hopefully we've covered some important territory and maybe made you think a little bit. I need to think some more, don't I? Go back to the drawing board, Ken.